The house stood on tall wooden stilts at the edge of black water that barely reflected the sky, as if even light hesitated to touch it. Cypress trees leaned inward from the swamp, their roots twisted and exposed like old bones, and the air carried the heavy scent of mud and something metallic beneath it, something that never quite left the lungs. Daniel Carter cut the engine of the pickup and sat still for a moment, listening. No highway noise, no distant neighbors. Just a wide, swallowing silence, broken occasionally by the faint ripple of water brushing against the stilts beneath the house. It was cheaper than anything else within 50 miles. That was reason enough. A fresh start was supposed to feel uncomfortable. His wife Laura stepped out first, shielding her eyes from the late afternoon glare as she studied the structure. The house wasn't abandoned, but it felt like it had been waiting too long. Sun-faded boards, rust streaks under old nails, a wooden staircase leading up to the porch, raised high above the swamp as if whoever built it understood something about the land that city people did not. Their son, Ethan, climbed out of the back seat, holding the dog's leash. The Labrador hesitated, paws planted against the dirt road, nose lifted toward the dark water beyond the reeds. Its ears flattened slightly. Daniel tugged the leash forward with a small laugh. "It's just a swamp," he said, more to himself than to the dog. They carried boxes up the stairs in silence. The porch creaked under each step, but the structure felt solid enough. Inside, the house was surprisingly bright. Large windows faced the water, letting in wide panes of pale light that shimmered across the surface below. From above, the swamp looked almost peaceful. Slow ripples, patches of floating vegetation, no visible movement beyond insects skimming the surface. Laura opened the back door that led to a narrow walkway wrapping around the house. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, though he wasn't looking at the view. He was watching the water line against the stilts. It seemed high for this time of year. The first night passed without incident, if you ignored the silence. There were no passing cars, no distant music, no barking dogs from neighboring yards, only the occasional hollow knock of something touching the underside of the house. Daniel told himself it was driftwood. The dog slept near the door, restless, lifting its head every time a faint splash echoed below. Around midnight, a dull thud vibrated through the floorboards. Not loud, just enough to feel. Laura stirred beside him. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Daniel listened. Nothing followed. "Probably debris hitting the stilts," he said. He did not add that debris usually moved with the current, and the current tonight felt still. By morning, the swamp looked unchanged. Ethan ran along the porch with the dog, laughing as dragonflies darted around him. Daniel leaned over the railing and studied the wood beneath the house. The stilts disappeared into murky water, where the surface darkened into something opaque and unreadable. He thought he saw a slow shift in the reflection near the far corner, a distortion that didn't match the breeze. When he blinked, it was gone. He climbed down the exterior ladder to check the supports more closely. The air under the house felt different, cooler, thicker. The water reached just below the floor joists. He crouched near one of the stilts and ran his hand along the wood. Something rough scratched his palm. He looked closer. Long, shallow grooves marked the surface, parallel and deep enough to expose fresh timber beneath older weathering. They were not cracks. They were not rot. They were marks. "Daniel?" Laura called from above. He stepped back, scanning the waterline. The surface remained flat, disturbed only by tiny insects landing and lifting again. He told himself it could have been old damage. The previous owner had mentioned wildlife in passing, but casually, the way people mention raccoons near trash cans. He climbed back up without saying anything. That afternoon, Ethan tried to lead the dog down toward the water's edge, along a narrow strip of higher ground between reeds. The Labrador resisted again, whining low in its throat. Its gaze remained fixed on a patch of shadow beneath the house. Daniel followed them halfway down the steps before stopping. The swamp made no sound. No frogs, no birds. Just a faint lapping against wood. Ethan tugged harder on the leash and the dog suddenly jerked backward, nearly pulling free, eyes wide, body trembling. Daniel felt irritation rise before something colder replaced it. Animals didn't argue with nothing. That evening, clouds gathered low and slow across the horizon, turning the sky a bruised gray. The air pressed heavier against the house, and the smell from the water deepened. Daniel stood alone on the porch as the light faded, watching the surface shift from dull green to ink black. He noticed something then, not movement exactly, but a shape beneath the reflection. A thicker darkness within the dark. It held position near the center stilt for several long seconds, before gliding soundlessly out of sight. No splash. No ripple large enough to break the illusion of stillness. Inside, Laura laughed at something Ethan said, the normal sound almost fragile against the quiet outside. Daniel remained on the porch longer than he meant to. The boards beneath his feet gave a faint, slow creak, as if adjusting to weight. He glanced down between the gaps in the planks. The water below reflected nothing now but his own distorted outline. Then, gently, deliberately, something bumped the underside of the house. Not debris, not drifting wood, a controlled, measured impact. The vibration traveled up through the stilts and into his bones. Daniel froze, staring into the black water, as if it might answer him. The surface remained smooth, innocent, unbroken. The swamp did not announce itself. It did not warn. It simply watched. Behind him, the porch light flicked on, casting a pale circle over the railing and stretching long shadows toward the water. For a brief second, two small distortions appeared within that reflected glow. Low, horizontal, almost aligned. Eyes would have made more sense, but he told himself it was only light bending on moving water. The house settled again, into silence, and the black water settled with it. The second night felt longer than the first, as if the house itself had begun to measure time differently. The storm clouds that had gathered the evening before never fully broke. Instead, pressing low over the swamp like a lid sealing something in, the air grew thick and unmoving, and the smell from the water deepened into something sour and organic. Daniel lay awake long after Laura and Ethan had fallen asleep, listening to the small sounds of a wooden structure adjusting to humidity and age. Each creak carried upward through the stilts, through the beams, into the floor beneath his back. At first, he tried to separate natural noises from imagined ones. Wood expands, water shifts, wind nudges. But sometime after midnight, the pattern changed. There was a slow scrape beneath the house, not a bump, not debris drifting, a scrape. It dragged across wood with deliberate pressure, paused, then continued, as if something heavy was testing the strength of the supports. Daniel sat upright in bed. The dog was already awake, standing stiff near the door, a low growl vibrating through its chest. The sound beneath them stopped instantly, as if it had heard the movement above. Silence followed. Deep, suffocating silence. Daniel stepped out onto the back porch with a flashlight in hand. The beam cut a narrow tunnel through darkness, catching suspended insects and drifting mist above the waterline. He moved slowly along the railing, angling the light downward between the gaps in the boards. The water reflected the beam in a fractured, trembling pattern. For several seconds he saw nothing. Then the reflection shifted unnaturally, not because of wind, but because something beneath the surface adjusted position. The beam slid across a patch of rough texture that did not belong to water, ridged, uneven, almost armored, before it vanished into deeper shadow. His pulse quickened. Probably a gator. He muttered under his breath, trying to keep the words small. Florida swamps had them. That was not unusual. What unsettled him was not the presence of one, but the stillness of it. It had not fled from the light. It had not reacted at all. He backed away from the railing and went inside without mentioning what he'd seen. Morning arrived, gray and heavy. Ethan asked if he could take the dog down near the reeds again, but the Labrador refused to leave the porch, whining and pulling backward toward the door. Daniel decided to check the supports more thoroughly in daylight. He climbed down beneath the house once more, boots sinking slightly into damp soil near the higher ground, before reaching the shallow water under the structure. The stilts looked intact from a distance, but closer inspection told a different story. Fresh marks carved into the wood, deeper now, wider. Parallel grooves pressed with force, not age. On one beam he found something worse. A shallow indentation shaped like a partial bite, splintered fibers curling outward. He crouched lower and dipped his fingers into the water near the damaged stilt. It was warmer than expected, warmer than air. He withdrew his hand quickly and scanned the space beneath the house. Shadows stretched in long angles between beams. The water level seemed slightly higher than yesterday, brushing closer to the joists. Maybe rain upstream. Maybe nothing. Behind him, something displaced the water without sound. He turned sharply, but the surface had already smoothed. By afternoon, the clouds thickened into a uniform slate ceiling. The first drops of rain fell slow and heavy, widening circles across the swamp. Laura watched from the window, unease finally reaching her voice. "Daniel, maybe we should call someone about the water level." He checked his phone. One bar of signal flickered, then vanished. The nearest neighbor was miles down the dirt road. It would take time to get there. As rain intensified, the swamp began to rise almost imperceptibly. The dark surface crept higher against the stilts, swallowing more of the exposed wood. The house did not move, but it felt lower somehow, as if the water were reaching for it. The dog barked once toward the back door, sharp and frantic, before retreating to the far corner of the living room. Night fell early under the storm. Wind pushed sheets of rain sideways against the windows. The porch light flickered in the gusts. Daniel stood again at the railing, watching the swollen water press closer to the floorboards. The reflection of the house trembled in distorted fragments. Then, beneath the distortion, he saw movement, slow and unmistakable. A broad shape gliding directly under the center of the house, not passing by, positioning. The rain masked the faint sound of water brushing against wood as something large shifted beneath the beams. Then came a solid impact from below, stronger than the night before. The entire floor shuddered. Laura gasped, from inside. Ethan's voice rose in confusion. The dog barked wildly. Another strike. This time the vibration lingered. Daniel dropped to his knees and pressed his palm against the boards. He could feel the pressure from beneath. Not random, not drifting. It was pushing upward with controlled force. He grabbed the flashlight again and angled it through the slats. The beam caught the water just long enough to reveal a massive, ridged back sliding along the central supports, scales scraping against wood. An eye surfaced briefly within the circle of light, unblinking vertical pupil fixed upward, before sinking again into blackness. It did not retreat. It stayed directly under them. The rain intensified into a full downpour, drumming against the roof in relentless rhythm. Water continued rising, inch by inch, until it nearly touched the lowest crossbeam. Daniel understood then that this was no passing animal seeking shelter from weather. It had chosen the space beneath the house. The stilts provided cover. The storm provided isolation. And the rising water eliminated escape routes. A loud crack split through the noise of rain. One of the outer supports shifted slightly, wood fibers straining under pressure. Laura stepped onto the porch, fear visible now without disguise. "Daniel, what is that?" He did not answer immediately. He watched the dark water pulse against the beams, watched the subtle wake of something circling tightly below. "It's not leaving," he said finally. And beneath them, as if in response, the house trembled again under a deliberate, testing blow from the black water. By the third night, the storm had settled into something relentless and methodical, no longer violent but constant, as if the sky had decided to feed the swamp inch by inch. The water had risen high enough to swallow most of the stilts, leaving only the upper portions visible beneath the floorboards, and the house no longer felt elevated above the marsh, but suspended within it. Daniel had wedged extra support beams where he could reach them, bracing wood against wood in a desperate attempt to counter the pressure from below. But every adjustment felt temporary. The dog refused to leave the center of the living room, ears pinned flat, eyes fixed on the dark gaps between the boards, where faint reflections flickered with movement. Laura kept Ethan close, her voice steady, but strained as she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in a place that no longer felt grounded in reality. The storm muted the outside world. No passing vehicles, no distant lights, no sign that anyone else existed beyond the swelling black water. Then the first real strike came, harder than before. Not a test, but an impact that lifted one corner of the house just enough to send a tremor through every beam. The sound beneath them was no longer subtle scraping, but a heavy collision, followed by a deep surge of displaced water. Daniel grabbed the flashlight and dropped to his knees again, forcing the beam through the narrow slats. And this time he saw it clearly. A massive armored back wedged between two central supports, jaws opening to clamp onto wood as if measuring how much force it would take to split it. He felt something shift inside him. A line crossed from uneasy suspicion into undeniable confrontation. He didn't think. He moved. He rushed down the exterior ladder into waist-deep water, despite Laura's shout behind him, boots sinking into soft mud as rain hammered against his shoulders. The space beneath the house felt suffocating, beams overhead forming a cage of shadows and low clearance that forced him to crouch as he sloshed toward the damaged support. The water vibrated around him, and before he could reposition the brace he'd brought, The surface in front of him exploded. The alligator lunged upward in a burst of muscle and spray, jaws snapping inches from his torso, the sheer force knocking him backward into a stilt. Pain shot up his spine as he lost his footing and plunged into the murky water, hands grasping blindly for stability, while the predator twisted in tight quarters between the beams. There was no open marsh here, no space for distance. This was a confined battleground of wood, water, and bone. Daniel surfaced coughing just as the tail slammed into his side, sending him crashing against another support. He swung the metal brace instinctively, striking the armored snout with a dull clang that reverberated through his hands. The animal recoiled only a fraction, enough to reposition and surge again, jaws snapping shut around the lower edge of a beam instead of flesh, splintering wood with horrifying ease. Daniel felt the structure shudder above him and realized with sudden clarity that every attack on him was also an attack on the house itself. He shoved the brace into the mud and used it to lever himself upward, scrambling along the narrow gap between supports, while the alligator pivoted with terrifying precision in water barely deep enough to conceal it fully. He saw the eye then, close, level with his own, unblinking and steady despite rain and chaos, and understood that this was not a random strike, but a territorial removal. He was the intruder. The next lunge caught him off guard. Teeth grazed his thigh, ripping fabric and scoring skin before he drove the brace downward again with a desperate roar, striking the sensitive ridge above the snout. The predator thrashed violently, tail smashing against multiple supports at once, and one of the outer beams cracked audibly under the combined pressure of water and impact. Daniel staggered backward toward the ladder as the animal withdrew just enough to circle within the confined space, stirring the water into a dark vortex beneath the house. Laura was screaming his name from above, and Ethan's voice broke through the storm in frightened fragments. Daniel climbed with shaking arms, blood mixing with rain along his leg, and hauled himself onto the porch just as another crushing blow hit from below. This time, the entire floor dipped slightly before settling back, a subtle but irreversible shift that told him the foundation was compromised. He turned toward the water beyond the railing and felt his breath catch, not because of the single broad shape gliding away from the beams, but because further out, beyond the reach of the porch light, additional ripples formed in widening arcs. The storm had driven more into the same flooded channel, drawn by current and scent, their silhouettes barely visible beneath the black surface. The first alligator had not been alone in the territory. It had simply been the one bold enough to claim the shelter beneath the house. Now the water surrounding them moved with layered shadows, slow and patient, circling as the structure above began to lean by degrees too small to see but large enough to feel. Daniel wrapped an arm around Laura and pulled Ethan closer as the next impact struck, and he understood that the fight had shifted from defending the stilts to surviving the collapse. The fourth night did not arrive with darkness. It arrived with surrender. The storm reached its peak just after midnight, wind driving rain sideways in relentless sheets, while the swamp swallowed the last visible inches of the stilts beneath the house. The floor had begun to tilt almost imperceptibly, a slow lean that forced furniture to slide inch by inch toward the back wall. Daniel could feel the weakness in the structure through his bare feet, each vibration from below traveling up through the beams like a pulse from something alive and waiting. Laura held Ethan tightly near the staircase to the attic access hatch, while the dog barked frantically toward the rear of the house, claws scraping against warped floorboards. Then the first internal fracture split through the living room with a sharp cracking sound that cut through wind and rain alike. One of the central beams gave way beneath sustained pressure, and the floor dipped several inches before stopping abruptly, water splashing up through the gaps in dark bursts. Daniel didn't hesitate this time. "Up," he ordered, voice steady, despite the blood still seeping through his bandaged leg. He forced open the attic hatch and shoved Ethan upward first, then Laura, then climbed after them as another violent impact slammed into the supports below. The house shuddered as though something massive had thrown its full weight against it. And this time, the wood did not fully recover. They crawled onto the roof through the narrow upper vent, rain instantly soaking them, wind nearly ripping them backward down the slope. The swamp stretched in every direction, black and endless under flickering lightning. The house groaned beneath their weight as the foundation continued to weaken, water now level with what had once been the floor of the main room. Daniel pulled himself to the ridge of the roof and looked down into the swirling flood surrounding them. At first, he saw only churning reflections distorted by rain, but then lightning tore open the sky and illuminated the water in a frozen flash of white. Dozens of low, horizontal shapes broke the surface at varying distances, unmoving except for the faintest drift with the current. Eyes. Not one pair. Not two. A scattered ring of them, reflecting light back toward the roof in cold, steady points. The storm had forced them into the same flooded basin, and the scent of blood had done the rest. The first alligator, the massive one that had claimed the space beneath the house, floated closest, its damaged snout angled upward toward Daniel, as if marking him specifically among the shapes above. The roof shifted sharply as another support collapsed entirely. A section of the house beneath them folded inward with a deep, crushing sound, sending a surge of water and debris outward in a violent wave. The structure was no longer leaning. It was sinking by degrees. Laura cried out as the slope steepened, and Daniel wrapped one arm around Ethan while gripping the metal antenna mast with the other to keep from sliding. The dog lost footing and nearly slipped over the edge before Laura grabbed its collar at the last second. The water climbed higher against the exterior walls, swallowing windows one by one. Every few seconds, a heavy body brushed against the submerged lower half of the house, not attacking in frenzy, but pressing, testing, waiting for gravity to finish the work. Lightning struck again, closer this time, illuminating the entire flooded landscape in brutal clarity. The ring had tightened. The water was alive with slow-moving backs and silent, patient forms. They were not thrashing. They were not competing. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse. Daniel's breath came in shallow bursts as he calculated distances that no longer mattered. There was no dry ground visible. The dirt road had vanished beneath the flood. Even if he tried to swim, he would be moving directly into a perimeter of predators that had already claimed the territory. The final fracture came from beneath them, with a tearing roar of wood and nails giving way all at once. The roof lurched violently, sliding several feet lower, as the entire central frame of the house crumpled into the swamp. Water surged over the lower edge of the shingles, icy and forceful, reaching their boots. Ethan screamed. Laura clung to Daniel with both arms as the antenna mast bent under combined weight and wind. For one suspended second, the storm seemed to pause between lightning flashes, leaving only the sound of rain and the slow, collective displacement of water around them. Then the sky split open again. In that blinding white instant, Daniel saw them all clearly. Dozens of reflective eyes encircling what remained of the house, layered at different depths, some closer than he had realized, others further out in silent formation. The massive, scarred alligator drifted directly below the edge of the roof, its head barely above the surface, its gaze unwavering. The roof shifted once more, the angle steepening beyond recovery, and Daniel understood that they were balanced on the last fragile piece of something already lost. He tightened his grip around Ethan, pulled Laura closer, and felt the structure begin to slide. The water rose to meet them, and as the roof finally gave way beneath their combined weight, the ring of eyes did not move in panic or frenzy. It simply closed in,